Thank you for watching the Jakarta Globe News Channel and for sticking around. I'm Florence Armein. On The Perspective today, we will learn more about the state of trade and investment in the country. And in the studio with me, we have the chairman of the Investment Coordinating Board, Mr. Thomas Lembong. Thank you and welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'd like to look at you as the most optimistic head of institution and also your former Minister of Trade for Indonesia, and you've always been very upbeat and optimistic about about the economic outlook, trade and investment in particular. Can you just share with us in general the current state of trade and investment in the country?
Well, first, Florence, I should say that I've not always been optimistic. In fact, 2012, 2013, 2014, and much of 2015, I advised candidate Jokowi, then President Jokowi, to be very cautious, bordering on pessimistic.
Okay.
And it was really only third quarter of last year,
Right.
fourth quarter of last year, that I turned optimistic. I think my optimism is based on two things, external and internal. The external reason I turned optimistic last year is because end of last year, the U.S. unemployment rate hit a 10-year low.
Right.
Right. So after the global financial crisis of 2008, when U.S. unemployment peaked above 10%.
Great.
And then last year, so over the last few years, it dropped gradually to 9, to 8, to 7, to 6. And last year, it hit a remarkable low of 4.9. Now it's 4.6. And so a strengthening U.S. economy will pull along the whole rest of the world,
Right.
and eventually including Indonesia. Now, the internal reason for my optimism is just the reform momentum, right? The seriousness of the president, the vice president, the coordinating ministers to continue rolling out reforms to the economy with the aim of improving our competitiveness,
Yeah.
and making the environment more business-friendly, more investor-friendly. I think we're now, I would argue, a year into the reform program when we started rolling out these so-called policy packages.
We're issuing the 15th chapter very soon.
Yes,
The government is.
Indeed. And I'm happy to report that I think third quarter to fourth quarter of this year, we're finally seeing investor sentiment respond. Right? After watching from the sidelines
Yep.
and more adopting a wait-and-see attitude, I think now in my meetings with investors, there's a palpable shift from interest to actual intention.
Right.
Right now, of course, it's our job to move investors from intention to realization.
Right.
But the momentum is there.
Okay, we'll get more into details into that, Chairman. Now, you're upbeat. BKPM as an institution is very upbeat about its investment realization target. Correct me if I'm wrong, I've got the number here. You have a target of 594 trillion rupiah, and so far you've achieved around 453 trillion rupiah up to September. There's 141 shortfall in which you would ideally want to meet by the end of the year. FDI, of course, still dominates a huge chunk of that.
I think upbeat, yes, but hopefully also realistic, right? I think being realistic is very important. And yes, with respect to this year's target, we're upbeat of being able to meet it. And again, for the external and the internal reasons I mentioned, we're also upbeat going into 2017. But of course, the way President Jokowi operates is, you reach a target, he'll raise it.
Yep.
So over the last 2 weeks, the president has announced, very ambitious targets for 2017 and 2018. Now, again, we want to approach these targets with a can-do spirit, with a can-do attitude, and we want to build on the positive momentum that we have now,
Yep.
right? But I would also have to admit that these are very, very ambitious targets. So, as you mentioned, the target for this year was 590 trillion. Next year it will be around 670 trillion. And the following year is supposed to be a whopping 860 trillion in annual investment, right? So
Right.
annual investment has to run at the rate of about 860 trillion rupiah per year by 2018. That's the president's target. Well, whether we succeed or we fail, we have to try.
Yeah.
Right, we got to try because investment is probably the main lever left that we can still push.
Yeah.
The other levers like government spending
Yeah.
are maxed out. Trade continues to be very soft. Our exports this year are still contracting. You know, they're contracting at a slower rate. Last year they contracted 14% year on year. This year they might contract 5 to 8%. So at least the rate of contraction is slowing down, but it's still contracting. In the meantime, consumption is already very strong, which means we can't push it harder.
Right.
You know, otherwise you would risk becoming what President Jokowi calls an over-consumptive society.
Right.
So the only thing left to do is focus on investment.
Okay.
And investment is a solution to many, many things, right? Investment that builds factories or provides jobs would raise income, which then provides the income to be spent on domestic consumption, for example.
And
right?
then that's the public is also consuming. Are we also looking at a higher percentage of FDI compared to domestic direct investment? So how do we boost
Right.
or at least level the playing field between domestic and foreign investments?
You know, the tax amnesty will have a sizable impact on domestic investment because you know, hundreds of trillions, in fact thousands of trillions of rupiah of previously undeclared assets have now been declared, right? So once these assets have moved, and these are domestic assets, domestic wealth, once these domestic assets have been moved from the informal sector into the formal sector,
Right.
then they can be used as collateral for bank loans. They can be expanded. They can be bought and sold. They can be, you know, developed further.
Right.
So I believe that a major reason that domestic investment has been growing as a proportion of total investment is because more and more activity is moving from the informal sector to the formal sector.
Right. And also this is inevitably connected to what they call trust.
Absolutely.
Within the markets as well.
Absolutely. Look, I think, in my view, President Jokowi has brought enormous changes in mindset, in attitude, and for example, you know, he now talks so openly about our shortcomings, the government's shortcomings. He even talked openly about corruption and what we call pungli, right? All the petty corruption, illegal levies, and so on. And he also talks openly about our problem of criminalizing what are business disputes.
Right.
I really think that kind of honesty does a lot to boost trust.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely correct. You know, business confidence consists to a very large extent of trust.
Right.
As an investor, do I trust this government?
Yeah.
Right? Do I trust this tax office? Do I trust these regulators? And frankly, a lot of people don't realize trust begins with honesty. So if we're not being honest, how can we expect trust and therefore confidence?
Right.
So I think the refreshing degree of honesty that President Jokowi has brought into the public dialogue, into the official rhetoric, has done a lot to win back trust from investors.
Right. The very fact that the government realizes and acknowledges its weaknesses, that's the very first step for a very important element of respect. We'll get into more on trade and investment in the country when we come back after this short break.